The rain hammered against the cobblestones of Rome's Via del Corso on March 15, 1848, as Cardinal Alessandro Barnabo hurried through the darkness toward the Palazzo del Quirinale. In his leather satchel he carried documents that would change the relationship between the Catholic Church and European secret societies forever. What Barnabo couldn't have known was that 3 blocks away, in a basement beneath a wine merchant's shop, 27 men wearing white aprons were conducting their own clandestine meeting. The Masonic Lodge of the Perfect Union had been watching the Cardinal's movements for weeks. The collision between Freemasonry and the Vatican wasn't born in shadowy conspiracy theories or fictional narratives. It erupted from the very real political upheavals that were tearing apart the old order of European monarchy and aristocracy. Pope Pius IX had already witnessed revolutions sweeping across Italy, France, and the Austrian Empire. But what terrified him most weren't the barricades in the streets or the Republican manifestos. It was the quiet infiltration of Masonic lodges into the highest echelons of European society. Consider this startling fact. By 1850, over 70% of the liberal politicians supporting Italian unification belonged to Masonic lodges. Giuseppe Garibaldi, the fiery revolutionary who would eventually unite Italy, had been initiated into Freemasonry in Montevideo in 1844. Giuseppe Mazzini, founder of the secret society Young Italy, maintained correspondence with Masonic leaders across Europe. Even more unsettling for Vatican officials was the discovery that several Catholic priests had secretly joined lodges in Naples and Turin. The Church's first systematic response came through Cardinal Barnabo's investigation into what Vatican documents called the Masonic penetration. Working from a cramped office in the Apostolic Palace, Barnabo compiled dossiers on suspected Freemasons throughout the Papal States. His reports, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, reveal a level of paranoia that bordered on obsession. One document dated April 22, 1849, lists the names of 43 Roman merchants, 12 lawyers, and 7 government officials suspected of Masonic affiliations. But the cardinal's fears weren't entirely unfounded. In the Sicilian city of Palermo, the Masonic Lodge of the Rising Sun had indeed been coordinating with revolutionary committees planning uprisings against Bourbon rule. Lodge meetings, disguised as cultural societies and reading circles, served as recruiting grounds for anti-clerical activists. The lodge's membership rolls, discovered after a police raid in 1851, revealed a sophisticated network spanning from Palermo to Messina, with connections reaching as far north as Rome itself. The Vatican's counter-offensive began with Pope Pius IX's papal bull Quanta Cura in 1894, but the real weapon was the accompanying document known as the Syllabus of Errors. This 80-proposition condemnation of modern liberalism specifically targeted secret societies, declaring it an error to believe that the Church ought to be separated from the state and the state from the Church. What made this document particularly explosive was its timing, coinciding with Garibaldi's final campaigns to capture the Papal States. In the mountain village of Mentana, 30 kilometers northeast of Rome, the philosophical battle became brutally physical. On November 3, 1897, Garibaldi's volunteers clashed with papal troops supported by French intervention forces. Among the Garibaldian casualties was Lieutenant Colonel Enrico Cairoli, a known Freemason whose lodge brothers had funded his military equipment. The irony wasn't lost on Vatican observers. Cairoli died fighting for Italian unification while wearing a Masonic ring bearing the square and compass symbols. The conflict's intensity deepened when investigations revealed that Masonic lodges weren't merely supporting political revolution, they were actively promoting what church officials termed spiritual revolution. Lodge documents seized in Bologna in 1898 contained elaborate rituals described as alternative sacraments. These ceremonies, performed in candlelit chambers decorated with Egyptian and Hebrew symbols, appeared to offer members a form of spiritual enlightenment independent of Catholic doctrine. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from the Lodge of Perfect Harmony in Florence. Vatican investigators learned that this lodge had developed what they called progressive Christianity, a theological framework that reconciled Masonic philosophy with Christian beliefs while rejecting papal authority. Lodge master Francesco Crispi, who would later become Prime Minister of Unified Italy, had written extensively about creating a religion of reason that would supersede traditional Catholicism. The geographical scope of this theological challenge extended far beyond Italy. In France, the Grand Orient of France had officially removed references to the Great Architect of the Universe from its rituals in 1877, essentially declaring its independence from any form of theistic belief. This development sent shockwaves through the Vatican, where officials realized they were confronting not just political opposition, but a complete alternative worldview. Cardinal Charles Lavigerie, Archbishop of Algiers, reported similar patterns emerging in French colonial territories across North Africa and the Middle East. Masonic lodges in Algeria and Tunisia were actively recruiting among local Christian populations, offering them a form of universal brotherhood that transcended ethnic and national boundaries. Lavigerie's letters to Rome describe lodge meetings conducted in Arabic, French, and Italian, suggesting a level of cultural adaptation that threatened traditional missionary work. The situation became even more complex when Vatican intelligence discovered that several prominent Catholic intellectuals were secretly sympathetic to Masonic ideals. Father Antonio Rosmini Serbati, a respected philosopher and theologian, had maintained correspondence with known Freemasons and expressed admiration for their commitment to social reform. While never proven to be a lodge member himself, Rosmini's writings about the need for church reform aligned suspiciously with Masonic principles of progress and enlightenment. By 1870, with the fall of Rome to Italian forces and the Pope's self-imposed imprisonment in the Vatican, the conflict had evolved from political disagreement to existential crisis. Pope Pius IX's declaration of papal infallibility at the First Vatican Council in 1870 wasn't merely a theological statement. It was a direct response to Masonic claims about the fallibility of all human institutions, including the Church. The final, dramatic confrontation of this opening phase occurred in the Trastevere district of Rome on September 20, 1870. As Italian troops breached the Porta Pia and entered the Eternal City, Masonic Lodge members gathered in the basement of the Café Greco to celebrate what they saw as the triumph of reason over superstition. 3 blocks away, in the Sistine Chapel, Pope Pius IX knelt before the altar and reportedly declared, "The gates of hell shall not prevail." Neither side could have imagined that their conflict would soon spread across oceans to the mountains of South America and the coffee plantations of Brazil. The rain that had fallen on Cardinal Barnabo's hurried journey 22 years earlier seemed prophetic now. The storm between Freemasonry and the Vatican had only begun, and its most dramatic chapters would unfold in lands where neither European revolutionaries nor Vatican diplomats had yet learned to navigate the complex terrain of colonial politics and indigenous traditions. The steamship Magdalena departed from Liverpool on October 12, 1871, carrying among its passengers a seemingly ordinary English merchant named William Thompson. Hidden beneath layers of silk and cotton in Thompson's trunk lay documents that would ignite conflicts across an entire continent. The Grand Lodge of England had commissioned Thompson to establish contact with revolutionary groups in South America, particularly those connected to what Vatican intelligence called the Masonic International. What church officials didn't realize was that the war they thought they'd won in Europe was about to explode across the coffee plantations of Brazil, the silver mines of Peru, and the pampas of Argentina. 3 weeks earlier, in a candlelit chamber beneath the Cathedral of São Paulo, Brazil, Bishop Dom Pedro Maria de la Cerda had received disturbing reports about secret meetings occurring throughout his diocese. Local priests reported that wealthy landowners, government officials, and even military officers were gathering in private homes, conducting rituals involving strange symbols and mysterious oaths. The bishop's investigation revealed something far more threatening than simple political dissent, an organized network of Masonic lodges spreading like wildfire through Brazilian society. The situation in Brazil exemplified the complex transformation occurring across Latin America in the 1870s. Unlike Europe, where Freemasonry primarily challenged monarchical authority, in the New World it confronted the fusion of colonial Spanish and Portuguese power with entrenched Catholic dominance. The stakes were fundamentally different. In countries where the Church controlled education, marriage law, cemetery rights, and vast agricultural estates, Masonic calls for secularization represented nothing less than social revolution. Consider the extraordinary case of Gabriel García Moreno, President of Ecuador from 1859 to 1865, and again from 1869 until his assassination in 1875. García Moreno had transformed Ecuador into what critics called a Catholic republic, consecrating the entire nation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus in 1873. His government mandated Catholic education, banned all secret societies, and granted extensive privileges to religious orders, particularly the Jesuits. When García Moreno learned of Masonic Lodge activities in neighboring Colombia and Peru, he reportedly wrote to Pope Pius IX declaring that the Masonic lodges of the neighboring countries instigated by Germany are vomiting against me all sorts of atrocious insults and horrible calumnies. The president's fears weren't entirely paranoid. Lodge documents discovered after his assassination revealed an extensive correspondence network linking Masonic groups from Quito to Buenos Aires. The Lodge of Perfect Union in Lima had been coordinating with similar organizations in Bogota, Caracas, and Santiago, sharing not just philosophical ideas, but practical strategies for undermining clerical influence. These lodges operated what they termed parallel institutions, secular schools, civil marriage registries, and non-denominational cemeteries that directly competed with Catholic services. García Moreno's assassination on August 6, 1875, became the defining moment of this continental struggle. As the president descended the steps of Quito's cathedral after attending Mass, 6 men attacked him with machetes and revolvers. His final words, "Dios no muere," God does not die, were reported across Latin America and Europe, transforming him into a martyr for Catholic conservatives while solidifying Masonic reputation for political violence. Whether Freemasons actually orchestrated the killing remains debated, but the symbolic impact was undeniable. The assassination's aftermath revealed the sophisticated intelligence networks both sides had developed. Within 48 hours of García Moreno's death, Masonic lodges from Mexico City to Montevideo had received detailed reports about the incident. Lodge Master Carlos Montúfar of the Quito Lodge of Humanity later wrote that the tyrant's death opens new possibilities for enlightenment in Ecuador, suggesting at minimum that Masonic leadership viewed the assassination positively, even if they didn't direct it. Meanwhile, the Church's response demonstrated equally impressive organizational capacity. Cardinal José Ignacio Victor Izaguirre of Santiago coordinated a continent-wide investigation into Masonic activities, establishing what Vatican documents called the American Network, a system of clerical intelligence gathering that paralleled secular diplomatic channels. By 1876, this network had compiled dossiers on over 300 suspected Freemasons across Latin America. The conflict's complexity deepened when both sides discovered they were fighting not just each other, but also the rapidly changing economic and social structures of post-independence Latin America. British commercial interests, particularly in Argentina and Chile, actively supported Masonic lodges as vehicles for promoting free trade policies that benefited English merchants. The Lodge of Southern Cross in Buenos Aires, established in 1872, counted among its members 17 British businessmen, 12 Argentine government officials, and 3 Italian immigrants who controlled significant portions of the city's import trade. French influence proved equally significant, but more ideologically driven. The Grand Orient of France had established what it called colonial outreach programs, designed to spread Republican ideals throughout Latin America. Lodge documents from Caracas reveal that French Masonic officials provided both financial support and ritual materials to Venezuelan lodges, specifically targeting areas where Spanish colonial traditions remained strong. The irony wasn't lost on church observers. European powers that had once competed to convert indigenous populations were now competing to secularize their descendants. The geographical scope of this struggle was staggering. In Colombia, the Lodge of Three Theological Virtues in Cartagena de Indias operated under a warrant from the Provincial Grand Lodge of Jamaica, creating legal and jurisdictional complications that Spanish colonial authorities had never anticipated. Brazilian lodges maintained correspondence with Portuguese and Italian Masonic groups, sometimes using coded languages that mixed Portuguese, Italian, and Latin to confuse censorship efforts. Perhaps most troubling for church authorities was evidence that some Catholic priests were secretly sympathetic to Masonic ideals. Father Miguel Hidalgo, the Mexican independence leader executed in 1811, had maintained extensive correspondence with known Freemasons, though he never formally joined a lodge. Similar cases emerged throughout Latin America, suggesting that the conflict wasn't simply between religious and secular worldviews, but between different visions of how Christianity should engage with modern political ideas. The situation became even more complicated when indigenous populations began forming their own interpretations of both Catholic and Masonic symbols. In Peru, Quechua-speaking communities near Cusco developed syncretic rituals that combined ancient Incan traditions with elements borrowed from both Catholic liturgy and Masonic ceremonies. These hybrid practices alarmed both church and Masonic authorities, who realized their European-derived institutions were being transformed by American realities. By 1877, the conflict had evolved beyond simple institutional rivalry. In Mexico, the struggle between Scottish Rite and York Rite Masonry reflected broader tensions between conservative and liberal political factions. President Porfirio Díaz, himself a Freemason, navigated between competing Masonic groups while maintaining careful diplomatic relations with the Catholic hierarchy. This triangular tension, church, conservative Masons, liberal Masons, created political dynamics that European observers found bewildering. The economic dimensions of this struggle became clearer when researchers examined lodge membership rolls alongside property records. In El Salvador, the Lodge Le Progrès No. 5, established in September 1871, included Vice President Manuel Méndez and numerous coffee plantation owners who controlled the country's primary export industry. When Bishop Tomás Pineda y Saldana issued pastoral letters threatening excommunication for Freemasons, he was essentially declaring war on the country's economic elite. The church's counteroffensive reached its peak with the expulsion of Jesuits from El Salvador in June 1872, followed by the banning of the Catholic newspaper La Verdad. But this victory proved Pyrrhic. Secularization policies that followed weakened church influence while strengthening Masonic networks throughout Central America. The unintended consequence was the creation of precisely the kind of secular political culture that European Masonic theorists had envisioned. As 1878 dawned across Latin America, both sides recognized that their conflict had transcended the ideological battles of post-Napoleonic Europe. In the New World, the struggle between Catholic tradition and Masonic modernization was reshaping entire societies. The next phase would take them into territories where neither European Catholicism nor Anglo-Saxon Protestantism had ever successfully established dominance. The vast indigenous heartlands of Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, where ancient spiritual traditions were about to collide with both Christian theology and Masonic philosophy in ways that would challenge every assumption both sides had brought to the Americas. The merchant Thompson's documents, still locked in his Liverpool trunk, seemed almost quaint compared to the revolutionary forces now spreading across two continents. The fog rolled down from the Andes peaks on November 4, 1879, as Father Mariano Atienza climbed the stone steps to the Cathedral of Cusco. In his leather case, he carried reports that would forever change Vatican understanding of what was happening in the mountains of Peru. What the Jesuit priest had discovered in the remote villages of the Urubamba Valley wasn't simply Masonic lodge activity. It was something far more unsettling. Indigenous communities had begun creating their own interpretations of both Catholic and Masonic symbolism, blending ancient Incan traditions with European secret society rituals in ways that challenged every assumption both Rome and London had made about their global influence. The situation had begun innocuously enough. In 1876, a Scottish merchant named Alexander MacDougall had established a small trading post in the village of Ollantaytambo, 40 miles northwest of Cusco. MacDougall, a member of the Lodge of St. Andrew in Edinburgh, had started informal gatherings with local mestizo merchants, teaching them basic Masonic principles as part of what he called commercial education. But when Father Atienza investigated these meetings 2 years later, he discovered something extraordinary. The Quechua-speaking villagers had transformed MacDougall's European rituals into hybrid ceremonies that incorporated the worship of Pachamama, the Incan earth goddess, alongside Masonic invocations of the great architect of the universe. The theological implications were staggering. Vatican documents from this period reveal that church authorities initially dismissed these syncretistic practices as simple confusion among primitive minds. But deeper investigation revealed sophisticated theological reasoning. The village elders had identified the Masonic compass and square, with ancient Incan symbols representing the harmony between earth and sky. They interpreted Masonic degrees of initiation as parallel to traditional Andean spiritual progressions, where individuals gained access to sacred knowledge through ritual purification and community service. Perhaps most disturbing to both Catholic and Masonic authorities was evidence that these highland communities were developing their own forms of resistance to outside control. In the village of Pisac, east of Cusco, indigenous leaders had created what they called La Hermandad del Condor, the Brotherhood of the Condor, a secret society that borrowed organizational structures from both Catholic confraternities and Masonic lodges while maintaining distinctly Andean spiritual practices. This brotherhood operated its own system of justice, controlled local water rights, and organized collective agricultural work, essentially creating a parallel government that answered neither to Lima nor to Rome. The catalyst for wider conflict came during the War of the Pacific, when Chile invaded Bolivia and Peru in 1879. Masonic lodges throughout Peru had initially supported the war effort, providing funds and volunteers for the national defense. But when Peruvian forces suffered devastating defeats at the battles of Corrillos and Miraflores in January 1881, allowing Chilean troops to occupy Lima, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Chilean Masonic lodges, operating under Scottish Rite jurisdiction, found themselves in the peculiar position of governing a country where both the Catholic Church and competing Peruvian Masonic lodges viewed them as foreign invaders. The Chilean occupation of Lima created unprecedented complications for Vatican diplomacy. Pope Leo XV had already issued his encyclical Humanum Genus in 1884, condemning Freemasonry as the kingdom of Satan. But Chilean authorities were themselves divided between Catholic conservatives and Masonic liberals. Chilean General Patricio Lynch, military governor of occupied Peru, was reportedly a member of the Lodge Hiram y Salomón in Santiago, while his deputy, Colonel Pedro Lagos, remained a devout Catholic who attended Mass daily at Lima's cathedral. This religious and political contradiction produced bizarre administrative conflicts. Chilean Masonic officials found themselves protecting Catholic churches from looting while simultaneously implementing secularization policies that weakened church authority. Meanwhile, Peruvian priests and Masonic lodge masters, traditional enemies, began coordinating resistance activities against the foreign occupation. Father Ricardo Palma, rector of Lima's seminary of Santo Toribio, was discovered maintaining correspondence with members of the Lodge Orden y Libertad, sharing intelligence about Chilean troop movements and supply routes. The situation became even more complex when evidence emerged that indigenous communities in the occupied territories were developing their own forms of resistance that drew on both Catholic and Masonic organizational models. In the Mantaro Valley east of Lima, Quechua-speaking villagers formed secret cells they called Los Hermanos de la Estrella, the Brothers of the Star, combining Catholic patron saint devotions with Masonic-style initiation rituals. These groups operated clandestine schools that taught literacy in both Spanish and Quechua, while maintaining traditional agricultural practices that the Chilean administration couldn't control or tax. The transformation was most dramatic in Bolivia, where the loss of its Pacific coastline to Chile created a national trauma that reorganized all social relationships. The lodge Los Huasques in La Paz, established in 1823 with Argentine and Peruvian support, had suspended operations during the war, but reformed in 1882 with a radically different character. Instead of European-style philosophical discussions, the Reformed Lodge focused on what its members called practical brotherhood, organizing mutual aid societies, establishing secular schools in Aymara-speaking communities, and creating credit cooperatives that challenged both traditional Catholic charity systems and foreign commercial control. The Vatican's response demonstrated both institutional flexibility and fundamental confusion. Cardinal Manning in London wrote to Pope Leo XIII in November 1883, that the situation in the Andes requires new forms of pastoral care that we have not previously contemplated. Church officials recognized that indigenous communities were creating religious syntheses that couldn't be simply categorized as either orthodox or heretical. The problem wasn't theological deviation in the traditional sense. These communities maintained belief in Christian salvation while incorporating non-European spiritual practices that predated both Catholic and Masonic arrival in the Americas. The geographical scope of this transformation extended throughout the Andean highlands. In Ecuador, still reeling from Garcia Moreno's assassination, indigenous communities in Chimborazo province began forming what they called Consejos de Hermanos, councils of brothers, governance structures that combined traditional Andean political practices with organizational techniques learned from both Catholic parish councils and Masonic lodge hierarchies. These councils operated independently of both church and state authority, collecting their own taxes, resolving local disputes, and organizing collective labor projects. Colombian highlands presented similar patterns, but with additional complications created by the country's ongoing civil wars between conservatives and liberals. The Lodge Caridad in Bogotá reported in 1884 that indigenous groups in Boyacá province had established Hermandades de la Montaña, mountain brotherhoods, that practiced modified Catholic rituals while using Masonic-style passwords and recognition signs. These brotherhoods controlled access to traditional pilgrimage sites, creating parallel religious economies that bypassed both church tithing systems and liberal government taxation. The economic dimensions of this highland transformation were equally significant. In the silver mining region around Potosi, Bolivia, indigenous workers had created cooperative organizations that borrowed management techniques from both Catholic confraternities and Masonic mutual aid societies. These cooperatives negotiated directly with mine owners, establishing work schedules that respected traditional religious festivals while maintaining production quotas acceptable to European investors. By 1885, over 3,000 miners belonged to these hybrid organizations, representing economic leverage that neither traditional church authority nor government regulation could effectively counter. The scientific approach these highland communities took to adapting foreign institutions was particularly striking. Village leaders didn't simply copy European practices, but systematically analyzed which elements served their specific needs. They adopted Masonic emphasis on education and mutual aid while rejecting philosophical materialism. They maintained Catholic sacramental practices while asserting indigenous rights to interpret theological concepts through traditional cultural frameworks. The result was institutional innovation that challenged fundamental assumptions about how religious and secular authority operated in colonial societies. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the physical manifestations of these cultural syntheses. In Tiwanaku, near Lake Titicaca, excavations have uncovered ritual sites where traditional Andean astronomical observations were combined with Masonic architectural symbolism. Stone circles incorporated both ancient Incan geometric patterns and European compass and square motifs, suggesting that these communities were creating sacred spaces that honored multiple spiritual traditions simultaneously. The culmination of this phase came during the Great Drought of 1886, when failed harvests throughout the Altiplano created conditions that tested all institutional loyalties. Traditional Catholic charity systems proved inadequate for the scale of need. Government relief efforts were hampered by political instability and foreign debt obligations, but the hybrid brotherhoods and councils that indigenous communities had created proved remarkably effective at organizing collective survival strategies, sharing seed stocks, coordinating labor exchanges, and maintaining food distribution networks that prevented mass starvation. By 1887, Vatican observers recognized that they were witnessing something unprecedented: the emergence of indigenous religious and political institutions that couldn't be classified as either Catholic or Masonic but drew strength from both traditions. These highland mysteries would soon inspire similar syntheses in other parts of Latin America, creating challenges that would force both Rome and European Masonic authorities to fundamentally reconsider their strategies for global influence. The next phase of conflict would move from the Andean peaks to the Amazon basin, where different indigenous traditions would create entirely new forms of resistance to European institutional control. The steamboat São Gabriel churned through the muddy waters of the Rio Negro on March 17, 1888, carrying a passenger whose mission would transform the ancient spiritual landscape of the Amazon basin. Dom Macedo Costa, Bishop of Belém do Pará, had received disturbing reports from missionary priests working deep in the rainforest. Indigenous communities were creating new forms of religious organization that borrowed elements from both Catholic liturgy and what appeared to be European secret society rituals. What the bishop couldn't have anticipated was that these Amazon syntheses would prove more resilient and innovative than anything witnessed in the Andean highlands, ultimately challenging both Vatican authority and Masonic orthodoxy in ways that neither institution was prepared to understand. The catalyst for this religious revolution had arrived 6 months earlier in the form of João Batista Silva, a mestizo trader from Manaus who claimed membership in what he called A Loja da Esperança e Futuro, the Lodge of Hope and Future. Silva's credentials were authentic enough. He carried papers from the Grand Orient of Brazil indicating his initiation in 1885, along with ritual implements that clearly identified him as a master mason. But when Silva began conducting meetings with rubber tappers and indigenous leaders along the Rio Solimões, he wasn't simply transmitting European Masonic doctrine. Instead, he was creating something entirely new, a synthesis of Masonic organizational principles with Amazonian shamanic traditions that produced hybrid brotherhoods unlike anything previously documented. The rubber boom of the 1880s had transformed the Amazon from a remote frontier into a globally connected economy practically overnight. British and American commercial houses in Manaus and Belém were financing rubber collection networks that extended hundreds of miles into previously unexplored river systems. These commercial relationships created opportunities for cultural exchange that European authorities had never anticipated. English merchants brought Masonic lodge charters from London. American traders carried ritual materials from lodges in New York and Philadelphia. Brazilian government officials, many of them Freemasons from Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, established administrative posts in frontier settlements where indigenous shamans and Catholic missionaries had been the only sources of formal authority. The result was a collision of worldviews that produced extraordinary innovations. In the settlement of Tefe on the Middle Solimões, Ticuna indigenous leaders had created what they called Irmandade da Serpente Grande, Brotherhood of the Great Serpent, combining traditional anaconda mythology with Masonic symbolism borrowed from visiting rubber merchants. The Brotherhood operated its own initiation ceremonies, conducted entirely in Ticuna language, but using modified versions of Masonic ritual tools, compass, square, and level, which they interpreted as representations of cosmic forces governing river levels, forest growth, and seasonal changes. Perhaps most remarkable was the Brotherhood's approach to what Catholics and Masons both considered fundamental theological questions. Where European traditions debated the relationship between reason and faith, the Tikkun synthesis focused on practical harmony between human communities and forest ecosystems. Their ceremonies included traditional ayahuasca rituals alongside prayers that invoked both Jesus Christ and the great architect of the universe, but the primary spiritual goal was maintaining balance between human needs and environmental sustainability, a concept that neither European Catholicism nor Enlightenment Masonry had seriously addressed. The Vatican's response revealed both institutional flexibility and fundamental confusion. Dom Macedo Costa's report to Rome, dated October 12, 1888, acknowledged that these Amazon syntheses couldn't be simply categorized as heretical deviations from Catholic orthodoxy. The indigenous communities maintained belief in Christian salvation and requested Catholic sacraments for birth, marriage, and death ceremonies. They honored Catholic saints and celebrated Christian festivals, but they also practiced forms of collective decision-making and spiritual leadership that operated independently of church hierarchy, drawing on both traditional indigenous practices and organizational techniques clearly borrowed from Masonic lodge structures. The commercial dimensions of this transformation were equally complex. The rubber trade had created new forms of economic relationship that existing religious and fraternal institutions couldn't adequately address. Rubber tappers, working alone for months in remote forest locations, needed forms of mutual support and conflict resolution that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. Traditional Catholic parish structures were geographically impossible to maintain across such vast distances. European-style Masonic lodges required regular meetings and formal facilities that nomadic rubber collection couldn't accommodate. The hybrid brotherhoods that emerged solved these practical problems through innovations that impressed even skeptical observers. The Brotherhood of the Great Serpent developed a system of communication using carved symbols placed on specific trees along river routes, allowing rubber tappers to leave messages about commercial opportunities, environmental dangers, and personal emergencies. These messages used a symbolic vocabulary that combined traditional indigenous pictographs with simplified Masonic symbols, creating a forest-wide communication network that operated independently of both church and government authority. Evidence from this period reveals the sophisticated theological reasoning underlying these Amazon syntheses. Unlike the highland communities of Peru and Bolivia, which had adapted European institutions to pre-existing indigenous political structures, the Amazon groups were creating entirely new forms of religious organization designed specifically for the mobile, multicultural communities that the rubber trade had produced. They weren't simply copying Catholic or Masonic practices, but developing hybrid institutions that addressed practical needs neither European tradition had anticipated. The situation became more complex when evidence emerged that some Catholic missionaries were secretly sympathetic to these innovations. Father Antonio Macedo Soares, working among Caxinawa communities in the upper Juruá River, reported to his superiors in 1889 that indigenous spiritual leaders were demonstrating theological sophistication that challenges our assumptions about primitive religious capacity. Soares had discovered that Caxinawa shamans were incorporating Christian concepts into traditional healing ceremonies while maintaining ritual practices that closely resembled Masonic degree progressions, suggesting cultural borrowing that was flowing in multiple directions simultaneously. The most dramatic confrontation came during the Festa de São João in Barcelos on June 24, 1890. Traditional Catholic celebrations of St. John the Baptist had been transformed by local indigenous communities into elaborate ceremonies that combined Catholic patron saint devotions with modified Masonic rituals, honoring John the Baptist as the patron saint of Freemasonry. The result was a religious festival that drew participants from dozens of indigenous communities while maintaining elements that both Catholic and Masonic authorities could recognize as authentic, even if the combination challenged both traditions' claims to doctrinal purity. Dom Macedo Costa's attempt to suppress these hybrid festivals produced unexpected consequences. Instead of returning to traditional Catholic practices, many communities simply moved their ceremonies deeper into the forest, creating mobile religious networks that proved impossible for either church or government authorities to monitor or control. By 1891, these forest brotherhoods were operating their own systems of education, conflict resolution, and economic cooperation that functioned effectively across tribal and linguistic boundaries. The transformation was most visible in the rapidly growing city of Manaus, where the rubber boom had created a cosmopolitan population unlike anything previously seen in the Amazon. The Lodge of Hope and Future, established in 1872, had by 1890 developed into a sophisticated network linking Masonic activities in Manaus with the hybrid brotherhoods operating throughout the river systems. Lodge records from this period reveal extensive correspondence with indigenous leaders, rubber merchants, and government officials discussing not just ritual matters but practical questions about education, healthcare, and economic development. The Vatican's institutional response demonstrated both recognition of the challenge and uncertainty about appropriate solutions. Pope Leo XIV's encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891 addressed the social questions raised by industrial capitalism, but offered little guidance for situations where indigenous communities were creating their own forms of religious and economic organization. The Amazon syntheses were producing results that seemed to fulfill Catholic social teaching about human dignity and community solidarity while operating through institutional structures that borrowed heavily from the secret societies that church doctrine condemned. By 1892, the Amazon had become a laboratory for religious and social experiments that challenged fundamental assumptions about how spiritual authority operated in modern societies. The Forest Brotherhoods had developed educational systems that taught literacy in multiple indigenous languages alongside Portuguese, Spanish, and sometimes English. They operated healthcare networks that combined traditional indigenous medicine with European medical techniques learned from Jesuit missionaries and Masonic lodge members working in urban areas. They created economic cooperatives that managed rubber collection and trade relationships while maintaining environmental practices that preserved forest ecosystems. The geographical scope of this transformation extended throughout the Amazon basin. In Colombia, the Macuna people had created Consejos de la Maloca, longhouse councils, that combined traditional indigenous governance with organizational techniques borrowed from both Catholic confraternities and Masonic lodge hierarchies. In Venezuela, Yacuana communities had developed trade networks that used ritual symbols derived from both Christian iconography and Masonic lodge emblems to facilitate commercial relationships across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The culmination of this phase came with the discovery of extensive correspondence between Amazon indigenous leaders and Masonic lodges in Europe and North America. Documents seized by Brazilian authorities in 1893 revealed that the Brotherhood of the Great Serpent had established formal communication with the Grand Lodge of England, requesting recognition as a legitimate Masonic organization while maintaining their synthesis of indigenous and European spiritual practices. The request created unprecedented diplomatic complications for both British Masonic authorities and Vatican officials, who suddenly found themselves confronting institutional innovations that neither their theological frameworks nor their administrative procedures were equipped to handle. The next phase of this continental struggle would move to territories where the collision between indigenous traditions, Catholic authority, and Masonic influence would produce even more dramatic transformations. The borderlands between Mexico and the United States, where revolutionary movements were already beginning to reshape the political landscape of North America. The Amazon had demonstrated that indigenous communities could create their own interpretations of European institutional models. But the Mexican frontier would soon reveal what happened when these cultural syntheses encountered the full force of modern industrial warfare and nationalist revolution. The telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages on May 25, 1910, as revolutionary forces under Francisco I Madero crossed the Rio Grande into Mexico. Among the hundreds of armed men streaming south from El Paso, Texas, was a figure whose presence would transform this regional uprising into a continental confrontation between ancient enemies. William Buffalo Bill Green, mining magnate, cattle baron, and worshipful master of the lodge, Montezuma in Cananea, Sonora. What neither Green nor the Catholic bishops watching nervously from Mexico City could have anticipated was that the Mexican Revolution would become the final battlefield where centuries of conflict between Freemasonry and the Vatican would reach its most violent and decisive confrontation. The revolution's Masonic character was established from its earliest moments. Francisco I Madero himself had been initiated into the Lodge Benito Juárez in 1893, following a family tradition that traced back to his grandfather Evaristo, one of the founders of Mexican Freemasonry in Coahuila. Madero's Plan de San Luis Potosí, issued in October 1910, contained language that Catholic bishops immediately recognized as Masonic in origin, calls for liberty, equality, and fraternity that echoed not just French revolutionary rhetoric, but the specific terminology used in Scottish Rite degree ceremonies. The geographical scope of Masonic involvement was staggering. Revolutionary commanders throughout northern Mexico had lodge connections that created an informal command structure parallel to their military organization. Pascual Orozco in Chihuahua had been initiated into the Lodge Cosmos in El Paso, Venustiano Carranza in Coahuila maintained correspondence with lodge masters throughout Texas and New Mexico. Even Pancho Villa, despite his peasant origins and limited formal education, had developed relationships with Masonic businessmen in Columbus, New Mexico, who provided weapons and ammunition for his irregular forces. The Church's response revealed both the depth of Vatican concern and the limitations of Catholic institutional power in revolutionary Mexico. Archbishop José Mora y del Rayo of Mexico City had been coordinating with papal representatives since 1908, developing what church documents called the Mexican Strategy, a comprehensive plan for maintaining Catholic influence despite the secularization policies that liberal governments had implemented throughout Latin America. But the revolution's intensity and geographical scope overwhelmed these preparations. Within 6 months of Madero's uprising, Catholic churches throughout northern Mexico were reporting systematic attacks by revolutionary forces who specifically targeted religious symbols and clerical authority. The situation was complicated by the revolution's genuinely popular character. Unlike the elite political struggles that had characterized 19th-century conflicts between liberals and conservatives, the Mexican Revolution involved massive participation by indigenous communities, agricultural workers, and urban laborers who had their own grievances against both foreign business interests and Catholic Church property holdings. Revolutionary forces weren't simply implementing Masonic anti-clerical policies, they were expressing generations of accumulated resentment against institutional authority that had excluded them from political and economic participation. The transformation was most visible in the state of Sonora, where Governor Plutarco Elias Calles had implemented what he called revolutionary reconstruction. Calles, initiated into the Lodge Cosmos in El Paso in 1905, used his Masonic connections with American businessmen to finance education and infrastructure projects while simultaneously closing Catholic schools and expelling foreign priests. By 1915, Sonora had established over 200 secular schools, built roads connecting mining districts with American markets, and created agricultural cooperatives that operated independently of both Catholic charity systems and traditional hacienda structures. The religious dimensions of this transformation went beyond simple anti-clericalism. Revolutionary leaders like Álvaro Obregón in Sonora and Salvador Alvarado in Yucatan were implementing educational programs that promoted what they called scientific socialism, a worldview that combined Masonic emphasis on reason and progress with Marxist analysis of economic exploitation. These programs specifically targeted indigenous communities that had maintained traditional Catholic beliefs, offering alternative explanations for social problems that emphasized structural inequality rather than divine providence. The Vatican's counter-offensive demonstrated both institutional sophistication and tactical desperation. Pope Benedict XV issued a series of diplomatic protests through the apostolic delegation in Washington, attempting to pressure the American government to restrict revolutionary access to weapons and financing. Church officials coordinated with conservative Mexican politicians to establish what they called Catholic Defense Leagues, armed groups that operated in central and southern Mexico, protecting church property and personnel while attempting to maintain traditional social relationships in areas beyond revolutionary control. The conflict's intensity reached its peak during the Cristero War from 1926 to 1929, when Catholic peasants in Jalisco, Michoacán, and Guanajuato launched armed rebellion against the anti-clerical policies of President Calles. The war's religious character was explicit. Cristero forces fought under banners declaring "Viva Cristo Rey," long live Christ the King, while revolutionary forces responded with Masonic symbols and slogans borrowed from French revolutionary tradition. The result was a civil war that killed over 70,000 people while permanently transforming Mexican religious and political culture. The geographical scope of this final confrontation extended throughout North America. American Catholic bishops coordinated financial support for Cristero forces through networks that paralleled the aid that American Masonic lodges were providing to revolutionary governments. Knights of Columbus chapters from Texas to California collected funds for Mexican Catholic refugees, while Masonic lodges in border states provided sanctuary for revolutionary leaders fleeing government persecution. The result was an international religious war conducted through informal networks that operated independently of official diplomatic channels. The economic dimensions were equally significant. The Mexican Constitution of 1917, drafted primarily by Masonic delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Querétaro, established revolutionary principles that directly challenged Catholic Church property holdings throughout Latin America. Article 27 nationalized subsurface mineral rights, eliminating the legal basis for Catholic Church mining revenues that had supported missionary activities since colonial times. Article 123 established workers' rights to organize and strike, undermining the paternalistic labor relationships that Catholic social teaching had promoted as alternatives to socialist revolution. The technological aspects of this struggle revealed how modern communication was transforming religious and political organization. Revolutionary forces used radio broadcasts to coordinate military operations while simultaneously transmitting anti-clerical propaganda to audiences throughout Mexico and the southwestern United States. Catholic responses included clandestine radio stations operated by priest engineers who had learned broadcasting techniques from Marconi Company technicians. By 1928, both sides were conducting sophisticated propaganda campaigns that reached audiences across national boundaries. The conflict's resolution came through negotiations that satisfied neither Vatican nor Masonic objectives, but established new frameworks for religious political relationships throughout the Americas. The Modus Vivendi Agreement of 1929 ended the Cristero War by guaranteeing Catholic rights to conduct religious services while maintaining revolutionary restrictions on church political activity and property ownership. The compromise represented recognition by both sides that modern industrial societies required forms of religious secular cooperation that neither traditional Catholic authority nor Enlightenment anti-clericalism could adequately provide. The transformation's lasting impact became clear during the 1930s, when both Catholic and Masonic institutions throughout Latin America adopted modified approaches that reflected lessons learned from the Mexican experience. The Vatican's encyclical Quadragesimo Anno in 1931 acknowledged the legitimacy of workers' organizations and social reform movements that previous church doctrine had condemned. Similarly, Latin American Masonic lodges began emphasizing social service and community development, rather than purely anti-clerical political activity. By 1940, the centuries-long struggle between Freemasonry and the Vatican had evolved into something neither side had originally envisioned. Institutional competition focused on social reform rather than ideological dominance. Catholic universities throughout Latin America began offering programs in engineering, medicine, and agricultural science that incorporated technological innovations originally promoted by Masonic educational initiatives. Masonic lodges established charitable foundations and community service programs that addressed social problems through methods that resembled traditional Catholic charitable works. The geographical legacy of this transformation extended throughout the Western Hemisphere. From the Arctic territories of Canada to the Pampas of Argentina, communities that had experienced centuries of conflict between Catholic authority and Masonic influence had developed hybrid institutions that drew strength from both traditions while serving local needs that neither European Catholicism nor Anglo-Saxon Freemasonry had originally anticipated. Indigenous communities throughout the Americas had created their own interpretations of both Catholic and Masonic symbols, producing religious and political innovations that challenged fundamental assumptions about how spiritual authority operated in modern democratic societies. The final irony was revealed in documents discovered decades later in both Vatican and Masonic archives. Leaders on both sides had recognized by 1920 that their conflict was producing unintended consequences that served neither institutional interest. The struggle between Catholic tradition and Masonic modernization had strengthened indigenous political movements, accelerated social revolutions, and created forms of religious syncretism that neither European Catholicism nor Enlightenment rationalism could control or fully understand. The real victors in this centuries-long conflict weren't the Vatican or the Grand Lodges of Europe, but the American communities that had transformed both traditions into instruments for their own liberation and development. The rain that had fallen on Cardinal Barnabo's hurried journey through Rome in 1848 seemed like ancient history now. The storm between Freemasonry and the Vatican had finally passed, but it had transformed an entire hemisphere in ways that neither side had anticipated or intended. The secret societies and the Catholic Church would continue to coexist throughout the Americas, but their relationship had been permanently altered by communities that had proved more creative and resilient than either European institution had imagined possible.